All right, so we're going to continue section 1.4. We're going to be talking about errors that can be made in having surveys administered as well as writing surveys. A survey in statistics we call the instrument or a survey tool. So when we have surveys, there's a few places that you can have issue. You can first of all have issue in just the way that the survey is presented to someone, being it either verbal or how it's written out, and you can also have the issue being psychological issues or actual deliberate issues. So the deliberate versus the ignorance. So the first one I want to talk about is called the Rosenthall Effect. This is a psychologically documented effect. And what this Rosenthall Effect talks about is how when we talk with someone, we have body language. And we're not always aware of our body language. And when we're giving a survey, our body language can tell someone what we expect them to say, or that what they have said was not what we expected and that it didn't really make us all that happy. And that's a really key factor in giving a survey verbally to someone in person. Even verbally, you can still give those context clues. So we want to make sure that when we give a survey, either verbally, over the phone, or in person, where the respondent is actually sitting there looking at us, that we keep our body language very flat and our intonation, the way we speak the words, the way we ask the questions, the same throughout every single question, because that can lead the person astray. Now, most of the time, that's not going to be a deliberate thing. That's just going to be who we are. We're humans, and we do give people these context clues with the way that we say things and the way that we move our bodies every time we're speaking. The next thing that we talk about is biased questions and loaded questions. Now, biased questions and loaded questions, this depends upon how the question is worded, and even to some extent how they're ordered. And ordering of the questions can kind of come in this grouping, or it can come in its own grouping. So I'll talk about it twice. With biased questions, what we're doing is we're wording the question in such a way that we elicit the response that we want. And again, this can be intentional, but it could be just simply a misuse of language. So we really want to get to the heart of this matter, and so we're trying to word the question to get to the heart of the matter. But as we do that, we're humans, and we get some language in there that indicates, oh, this is the answer that we actually want, and that's what ends up being a biased question. Now, a loaded question is a little different. Loaded questions are ones that are inescapable in the way you answer them. So one of the most famous loaded questions is the question, how often do you beat your children? Or how many times a day do you beat your children? Well, the question already assumes that you're beating your children. So in answering the question, you're kind of caught in a catch-22. So we have a loaded question there, and we want to avoid asking any question that is going to trap someone into an answer that's not going to represent them fully. Now, ordering of questions can also lead someone down a path that you want them to take. And there's a fine line there between leading them down the path that you want to take and getting the information out that you want, and actually leading them to the answer that you want them to give. So you have to be careful in ordering of the questions in that way as well. Going along with that, this idea of biased questions, as well as the idea of self-preservation. If you ask a question in such a way that someone feels like they're being put on the spot, or that they may be judged by what you've asked them, they're not as likely to answer the question honestly. So we have to be careful when we word them that someone's not going to try to preserve their dignity, their reputation, etc. by answering your questions. A good example is self-preservation and how we avoid people having issues with self-preservation is the question of income. You probably noticed that no one ever asked outright what your actual income is. And the reason for that is self-preservation. People are embarrassed sometimes by their income. People like to flaunt their income. And so what we do instead is we say, here's a range of values. And therefore people can not quite identify their income level, but put it into a range. And it's human nature to think, oh, it's always at the top of the range if it's good, or at the bottom of the range if it's a bad thing. The same thing can be true of weight. So those are self-preservation type of situations. Now, another thing that talking about ordering of questions, when we create a survey, when we create one of these tools or instruments, what we want to do is we want to think in advance about the questions that we're asking. And we want to make sure that the first part of the survey is really super impersonal kind of questions that everybody gets asked. You know, what's your gender? What is your age grouping? What's your, these kind of demographic informations, because everybody's used to being asked those questions. So they're like, oh yeah, just another survey, going to answer these. And as you're asking your questions, you get into more and more sensitive subjects. So you're creating what we would say term maybe as a repertoire with the respondent. What you're doing is you're setting up that respondent to be more comfortable with your survey and with the questions that you want. And then somewhere in the middle is where we start asking any difficult type such questions. And finally, if your survey is long, you definitely want to think about that again, because you don't want questions at the end that are really super important or hard to answer. You want questions that kind of go back to being easy, getting that information out that's not going to tax somebody's brain. They don't have to think about it very hard, because you're not going to get questions answered that have a lot of thought basis to them after a long survey. People are done with you and they want to get on to the next thing. And that also begs the question of how long your survey should be, and that can be another problem with surveys, getting the information you need but getting it in a timely manner. So these are all things that we need to think about and realize that they can sway the information that we get. All right, the next thing that we want to talk about is interpretation of the data. So once we get our information, then how are we going to tell other people what that meant, or how are we going to decide what it means and then represent that? So one of the first things that we want to realize is that we don't want to take information and establish a cause and effect type of relationship to the information too quickly. So one of my favorite examples is the jellyfish and ice cream example. The jellyfish and ice cream example goes something like this. There's a beach in Australia, and during a certain time period, it's noticed that ice cream sales are way up and jellyfish stings are way up. So one of the cause and effect kind of scenarios that could arise from this is that when people are eating ice cream, it's more likely to be stung by jellyfish. Well, that's absolutely not true. It just so happens that ice cream sales are up when temperatures are up, and jellyfish stings are also up when temperatures are up, because there are more people actually in the water on the beach, and then something could possibly be going on with the jellyfish. So when you're trying to establish some type of cause and effect relationship, the key there is not just to look at a partial picture. You want to look at the whole scenario. What else is going on? And in statistics, when we study things like the demographic information and get our background information, that's some of the things that we're trying to establish. What may be some of the other things that are influencing what we're picking up on in the data? And so it's very, very important to get all kinds of information when you're doing a study, not just the stuff that you think you need, maybe stuff that doesn't seem quite as relevant to others because you want a whole picture. All right, a self-interest study, that's another thing we want to be careful of interpreting, and especially as a consumer. You want to ask, okay, this information's coming to me. Who collected this information? Especially if it's about a product, right? Do you want to have information about a product given to you by the company who produces the product? That's what we would call a self-interest study, because you're a little hesitant to believe it if they're saying it about yourself. It's like if this person walks up to you and says, I am the most wonderful person in the world, I can do blah, 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 and then do blah, 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 and I'm so awesome, just look at me. As opposed to the person who really doesn't say too much about themselves, but 5 other people come up and tell you that person is fantastic. Oh my goodness, they are wonderful. They do this and that and the other thing for our community and blah, blah, blah. Now you believe it a lot more than somebody just tooting their own horn. That's the idea of the self-interest study. And again, this can be done deliberately, or it can be done just because there's no other choice, right? Somebody who needs information about their product may think, okay, well, I'm going to go get that information. Maybe they don't have the money to hire someone else to do it, so they go and get it themselves. But it makes that information maybe a little bit less believable. Now, the next thing that we want to be careful of is partial pictures and precise numbers and deliberate distortions. Deliberate distortions, we can use statistics to lie. They're numbers. We can say they mean something when they really don't. We've talked about a lot of different places that things can be deliberate. We've also talked about partial pictures. Partial pictures being, visual as well as not seeing the big picture of the information that's going along with the information that we're trying to gather and study. So partial pictures and deliberate distortions I've actually talked about in a couple of different ways. Now the last one that I want to talk about is precise numbers. So let's say that I tell you that in the entire school there are 492 people that believe that the grass in the courtyard should be eliminated. Oh, 492. Well, what does that tell you? It tells you more than likely that I've gone out and I've talked to every single person in the school, right? Just imagine my sample or my population being bigger than just the school. Maybe it's California, maybe it's the United States, maybe it's North America. The availability of counting everyone gets less and less as we get to be a bigger and bigger population. So what we should be hearing are statistics, not what we call parameters, right? And therefore, when we hear in a precise number, that's going to give us a little less warm, fuzzy feeling than about 490 people, right? 491. That kind of leads me down to the path to believe that you've talked to everyone, so you know exactly how many people there are. And exactly is not going to happen very often. So those are just some of the things that we want to be good consumers. All right, that wraps up section 1.4.